There we go, pressing record. Lovely. Okay, so thank you to everybody for joining this session, and also thank you to Dan Knowles, who's going to deliver this session for us. I've known Dan a little while. We recorded a podcast, which I tell everybody about because it was such an inspirational one. Was it episode 15? 15 or 16?
Yeah, I think it was about that. Yeah, it was quite an early one. It was
one of the early ones that I recorded in lockdown. Did I make you do like a 6 o'clock in the morning review it to do it, or was I kind?
It was early. I think it was about 7 in the morning.
Yeah.
It must have been May, because I remember you saying that it was your birthday recently, and you told me it was right. May the 4th.
Yeah, that's it. That's me. Star Wars baby. Yeah, I think that would have been the first lockdown, I think it was, and I was making people do record interviews on the podcast early in the morning or in the evening, so that I could do childcare, thinking that I did nailed when I didn't. So but yeah, it's a really good one to watch. I'll put the link in the chat, or you can go and find it on the website. And these are the Surveyor Hub sessions. If you've not attended them before, they're a really informal way of surveyors sharing with other surveyors a bit of CPD, a bit of knowledge on various different things. It's not paid CPD in the formal sense, but I think in the Surveyor Hub, we're very much about community and sharing. So thank you to Dan for coming and sharing a bit more. I am getting the rest of the other ones on a website page. So if you're watching this on replay on a website page, well done you. If not, thank you for joining live. And also, every time something happens in my business, I make a difference in the world. I'm a global partner with B1G1. So for every one of you who has registered live and attended, then we make a difference, and you've all made a difference by donating to various causes around the world. And you can find out a bit more about that on my impact page. But at the moment, I think we're supporting people being able to build homes in India. So for every one of you that has attended live, you donated a brick just by showing up. So thank you very much for that. And you'll get a bit more detail about that on the email, I think, when you registered. So Dan's going to do his thing and tell us all about CPO and compulsory purchase orders. And what we're going to do in this session, sometimes we take questions as we go along, but I'm mindful this is being recorded. So what we're going to do is, I'll monitor the chat and let anybody in who's a latecomer. And then if you want to think about some questions, if you can put the letter Q in, then I will monitor them. And when we get to the end, we can answer some questions. And if you've got time, then we can press stop and do a little bit of a Q&A. You can put your video on and say hello, depending on how we go for time. So anybody's got any questions right now, pop them in the chat. Otherwise, I will hand over to Dan to go and do his thing. And if you need anything, Dan, shout, and I'll try not to cut you off.
Okay, great. Thanks, Marianne. Well, thanks everyone for coming along. First of all, if you see me looking to the side, that's because I've got 2 screens in front of me, and I'm just looking at the other one where my PowerPoint presentation is, which hopefully everyone can see on their screen. And if you can see it's all blurry behind me, that's because I've got 2 young children who have messed up the room, and this way you can't see the mess. So let's get into compulsory purchase. Often referred to as the dark arts. You'll probably come to realize why as I go through the presentation. The idea of today is we're going to go through some basic entitlements. So this is entitlements for residential properties. I'm not going to get into commercial. So for residential properties, whether your client is a landlord or whether they're a resident owner. We'll go into the process a little bit as well with some of the key steps in a compulsory purchase order. And also we'll talk about the different roles that surveyors play as well. So first of all, on entitlements for resident owners, the main thing that we are valuing and negotiating on behalf of any of our clients, of course, is the market value, the one right in the middle here. Now, this is not market value that an estate agent might tell you, because an estate agent If they know the area, first of all, they probably shouldn't be valuing in the first place, because there's the threat of demolition, and they'll realise they're not going to get a sale out of it. And if they don't know the area, well, why are they involved anyway? But also any valuations that an estate agent might tell you, if they are aware of the threat of regeneration, are going to be on a blighted basis. That is, what would someone pay for the property in the knowledge that it has a short life, that it's under threat of demolition at some point. And one rather interesting investment opportunity for any surveyors who advise on investments is we do find some landlords will look specifically for a property that is going to be demolished. They will buy it on a cash buy only basis because it's difficult to get a mortgage. They will wait a number of months or a number of years, and then they will sell it on an unblighted basis, which is what the law requires. So that an unblighted basis is, let's pretend there is no threat of demolition, what someone would pay for the property. So if they're buying it on a blighted basis, artificially cheaply, and then selling it on an unblighted basis, the value goes back up, and then they're getting additional compensation on top, then that's how some are making their returns. Now, for resident owners, as well as the market value, there is also something called home loss compensation. In simple terms, that is an extra 10%. So on a value of 100, it's 10, 200, 20, 300, 30, and so on and so forth, right up to a cap of £780,000 properties, which gives you £78,000 in the home loss payment. And then there's something called disturbance compensation, which covers costs relating to other issues, predominantly moving costs, things like solicitors' fees, surveyors' fees for moving, mortgage arrangement fee, and the like. And I'll come on to that quite shortly. And it's very similar for landlords as well. So a landlord still gets that market value. That's exactly the same, whether you're a landlord or whether you're a resident owner. But landlords don't get the 10%. They get an extra 7.5% instead. It's called a basic loss payment. And they also get disturbance compensation, but disturbance is calculated a little differently for landlords, which I'll come on to just a moment. So for resident owners, it's market value plus 10%. For landlords, it's market value plus 7.5%. And I should say they do need to have owned the property for 1 year at the point that agreement is reached in order to qualify. So you can't buy a property on a Monday and sell it on a Tuesday and make a big profit. Then disturbance compensation. If we look down the list on the left-hand side, first of all, for resident owners, the main items are the ones at the bottom. So stamp duty, land tax, solicitors' fees, mortgage arrangement fee, survey fee, and a couple of small items at the bottom there as well. These are items that are claimable under disturbance compensation from the acquiring authority, typically a council. And these are claimable subject to something called the principle of equivalence. So if you, for example, if your client is selling somewhere at a purchase price of £300,000 and they're buying somewhere at £1 million, they've just won the lottery, fantastic. It wouldn't be reasonable to expect the local council to pay stamp duty for buying £1 million property. So there would be a cap of whatever the stamp duty would be, in that case at £300,000. So this is all subject to the principle of equivalence. Similarly with a mortgage arrangement fee. If someone has got a £50,000 mortgage now and they're taking out a £500,000 mortgage where they move to, then they're not going to get the whole arrangement fee paid for them. They're only going to get a portion of it. The top part there, floor covering, window dressing, furniture that can't be reused. These are more small incidental costs. Floor covering, for example, will be non-fitted flooring, so something like a carpet. which in theory you could pick up and take with you. In practice, it doesn't really happen very well. So you can get compensation for that. You wouldn't get compensation for, let's say, tiled flooring, which you're not going to be able to get up very easily. That would be classed as a fitting. And for landlords, it's not as generous, I'm afraid. So landlords can't get anything about their old flooring or window dressing, any furniture that they can't reuse, if any belongs to them, of course. What they are looking at, though, are these costs relating to buying elsewhere: the stamp duty, land tax, the solicitor's fees, mortgage arrangement fee, and a survey fee, of course. Now, these costs for landlords can be higher than it would be for a resident owner. I'm thinking in particular the stamp duty, land tax, and sometimes the mortgage arrangement fee. Stamp duty, for hopefully everyone knows, there's a 3% surcharge for landlords. And if they're outside the UK, then there's an extra 2% on top of that as well. These are all recoverable, but there is that cap again based on the purchase price that someone is selling at. And when it comes to disturbance, there are a couple of ways of claiming. You can either look to get the money on the day that you sell or your client sells, and that would be based on estimates of what these different items would add up to, and that's something that needs to be negotiated. Or the fallback position is the legal route of you pay out and then you show all of your receipts, your invoices, and then claim back. Now, if you're going to do that, then for landlords, there is a tighter requirement that they need to buy within 1 year of when they sell, if they're going to be able to reclaim. So if they do buy a year and a day after they sell, then it's too late. They're not going to be able to get anything back. For resident owners, while strictly there is no time scale, in practice, the Limitation Act 1980 provides a 6-year period following which you can't refer to an independent tribunal. So on a practical basis, you look at 6 years. Then you've also got the professional fees as well. So solicitors' fees and surveyors' fees. These are for the sale now. Now, for solicitors' fees, their job is to merely deal with the conveyancing, transferring ownership to the local authority in exchange for however much has been negotiated. And that fee will normally be met directly by the local authority. Solicitors' fees for buying somewhere else comes under that disturbance compensation. So they are both paid, but under different heads of claim. And surveyors' fees are also paid. Now, surveyors' fees have to be reasonable. There is a professional statement called Compulsory Purchase and Statutory Compensation. It's an RICS guide, which there is actually a new one out to consultation at the moment. So the existing one's a few years old, but watch this space. There'll be a new one coming out in the next couple of months once that consultation exercise is finished. And with what is reasonable for a surveyor's fees, well, it depends on a couple of things. The expertise of the surveyor, someone who does this day in, day out, is likely to be able to charge at a higher rate than someone who hasn't done it before. But also the complexity of the claim, the value of the claim, and the nature of the service that's provided. So how much is the surveyor actually doing for the work? Now, it can be quite a good earner. So that's on the positive side. On the negative side is it can take a long time to get paid. Typically, we look at a year and a half or so from first being instructed to actually receiving any funds. It's a long time to wait, but then it pays quite well when it does. This slide should have been one further up because we've just talked about disturbance compensation, so I won't repeat that. So we'll now get into, in fact, I'll stop just one moment. Marion, are there any questions from anyone on the entitlements before I go into the process?
Nothing at the minute, but if anyone's got anything, if they want to pop anything in, we can quickly answer. 1 second. No.
Nope.
Not if
Okay.
you want to carry on.
I'll keep going. Okay. So next we'll talk about the process. So when a compulsory purchase order is made, people get a bundle of paperwork through the front door, and people get scared. They think, oh dear, the local council are going to take my home, and they're going to take it really quickly. Well, that's not actually the case. A compulsory purchase order being made, in simple terms, is the council requesting permission from government for consent to take people's properties. Now, of course, government can say yes or no. Almost invariably, government do say yes. Until the last few months, there was a 96% success rate, but there are 2 quite high-profile compulsory purchase orders that have failed just in the last 2 months. So there might be a change in the wind there. But generally assume that council are likely to get the powers, but there's a long process that they need to go through to get that. It's not an overnight thing. And when they make that compulsory purchase order, there'll be documents that get sent out. One is called a statement of reasons. Now, this, in simple terms, is the council's justification for why they think that they should get the compulsory purchase powers. Which is normally the council estate we're working on that we want to regenerate is terrible. There's high crime, there's this, there's that, there's the other. The buildings are all falling down. What we're going to build is nice and shiny and will be a lot better, and it will be in the public interest. And that there'll be various sources of legislation that they need to comply with within that document. Some residents, when they receive that statement of reasons, will actually read it, and then they'll get annoyed because the area that they live in is made out to be even worse than most people would probably see it genuinely is. It can be a bit Punch and Judy at times. The council have got to make it out to be as bad as they possibly can do to help them get the powers. Then there will be a schedule of interests. Now, this is a long list of names and addresses of all of the people who are entitled to be notified about the compulsory purchase order. And depending on which scheme it is, these can easily run into 50, 100, 200 pages or so. And being notified that this even involves anyone who's over the age of 18 who lives in the property, regardless of whether they rent it, whether they own it, or maybe they're just an adult son or daughter of the person who does own it or who does rent it. Even mortgage lenders get put on there, and even people with potential rights of light claim get put on there as well. Sometimes the council will actually serve this big wedge of a document on every single property. Sometimes they will tell people this document is in your local library or it's online somewhere. If they put them online, they tend to redact them. If it's in the local library, then some libraries will be under instruction from the council not to allow it to be photocopied. I once went to one local library and asked, well, can I photocopy this? I was told, no, you can't. I said, okay, well, can I photograph every page of it with an iPad? Okay, well, yes, you can do, because we haven't been told you can't. So I ended up doing that, and I then cross-checked that against our own records for who lived where.
Can I just chip in there? Why is that so difficult? Why? I mean, that's not helpful, is it?
It's not, and there's a couple of reasons. One, local authorities don't necessarily want surveyors to be negotiating with them, and a surveyor finds this list of potential clients, they can write to them directly and say, can we help you? Is
that because then the client, the homeowner client, can get more money out of the council?
Absolutely, yes. And the other reason, there are quite often residents groups who are against regeneration, people who will jump up and down, shout, I don't want this to happen to us. the people who shout the loudest are normally the ones who, if they get hold of that information, they will then go door knocking and get their group as large as they possibly can. I worked on one council estate where one of our clients padlocked her head to construction gates with a bike D-bar. That was all part of the residents group. There were the same client, her mother ended up being on the One Show. She was a regional darts champion, an 86-year-old lady, did not want to lose her home.
And I guess this is it just shows how emotive all of this is. Because on the one hand, sometimes when you look at the bigger picture, it's right to regenerate, to knock down, to think, for, there's that part of it, but then equally, these are people's homes, and how do you know that all avenues have been explored? And they are tough calls, you get that. And you can see the emotion around it, but that's not particularly helpful from the councils to make it difficult. They've got to be better at dealing with it, surely. Oh, it's just a view.
Yeah, I would like them to be, as someone who always tries to get their hands on these lists. But there are so many that aren't. And even when they deal with surveyors, there are some councils that we negotiate with quite regularly who are absolutely fantastic, and they'll be really pleased if they hear that we're involved, because they know that we'll talk on a pragmatic basis, we'll get deals done, we'll help people through a difficult situation. But there will be other councils who will do everything that they possibly can to be obstructive to surveyors getting involved, because they know it costs them more money and they don't want to pay it. And sometimes it comes down to, well, who's holding the purse strings? Is it the local authority themselves? And how much money have they got in the budget? Is it perhaps a developer who are indemnifying the local authority, and the developer's responsibilities to their shareholders, which then, if they can buy properties in cheaper, then sometimes that works better for them. Again, that's not always the case. Sometimes there are very good developers who see the benefit in doing deals early, treating people fairly, and doing the right thing.
Do you get to see that, though? Who's got the purse strings? Do you get to find that out as part of what you're doing? Is it just who you know and what you can find out?
More often than not, it's who you know and what you can find out. Compulsory purchase is a very, very, very niche area. It's a small world. That's why it's often referred to as the dark arts. Because there aren't many people who work in the area, and those who do, we all know each other, so we get to find out things that other people wouldn't necessarily. Yeah, it's a tough nut to crack, but once you're in, it can be quite a good one as well.
Very good, thank you.
And then the other document is a letter to those who are affected, which simply tells people, we are compulsory purchasing your property. This is what's now going to happen. And people are normally given, more often than not, it's a 28-day period within which they can object. Sometimes it's 21, but normally 28. And that objection isn't writing to the council saying, I don't want to lose my home. That objection is writing to the Secretary of State, suggesting why it's not in the public interest. And there are various different tests for the economic, environmental, and social well-being of the particular borough, for example, or particular council area. So there are limited grounds that objections can be submitted on. But where objections are submitted, and they need to be on those qualifying grounds, there's a couple of things that can then happen. Those objections can be withdrawn by agreement, and sometimes homeowners will use them as leverage. I'll withdraw my objection if you give me a better financial package. Sometimes there is a public inquiry that takes place, and if the agreements are not withdrawn, then there will be a public inquiry. And public inquiry is under court rules, which go on to the next one now. So a public inquiry is where government will assess whether or not normally a local authority should get the compulsory purchase powers. So it will hear both sides of the argument, for and against. Now, those against are typically the objectors, and whilst they might have objected on relatively spurious grounds. And I've seen objections on things like flora and fauna, for example, which while some people it may be the top of their agenda, more often than not, if you're losing your home, it's probably not at the top of your agenda, but it might be something that you've used as a ground of objection to try and stymie the process. So the people who are objecting, in most cases, they're everyday normal people. They're not necessarily professionals, or if they are, they're certainly not professionals working in property. Whilst the people who are on the council side at public inquiries, typically there might be a QC or a KC, as they now are, so King's Counsel rather than Queen's Counsel, maybe a barrister or two, and there will be expert witness after expert witness after expert witness. I've been to public inquiries before where I know that local authorities have spent £200,000-400,000 just trying to get compulsory purchase powers. And they will have these expert witness after expert witness after expert witness. Whilst on the other side, they might be against a guy who works in a warehouse and a woman who works at Tesco's. So as you can imagine, there's a huge inequality or access to justice, really, which leads to that 96% of the times that the local authority will be granted the compulsory purchase powers. Public inquiries will normally get called a few months or so after the objections. They can just last a couple of days, but they can last a few weeks depending on the size of the scheme. Just talked about the inequalities. The objectors can speak if they want to. Similarly, a surveyor can speak if they want to as well. But the surveyor can only really speak about the process and whether or not the council have followed the legislation. So a surveyor can't speak to say, well, we're objecting because the council haven't offered enough money for our client. They're offering something below market value. And the reason for that is that there is a separate route to be able to get determination of the market value if it can't be agreed. It's just unfortunate, and it's one of the problems with the system, that separate route, which is going to the lands chamber, is completely unviable for most people. For anyone who's worked in leasehold reform, dealing with lease extensions or collective enfranchisement, you'll know that there are routes to the first tier tribunal, where it's relatively cheap, might be a few £1,000s or so, to try and get a judgment. With compulsory purchase, there is no first tier tribunal. It is straight to the upper tribunal of the lands chamber, where unless you're at least £100,000 apart or so on opinions of market value, it's really not worth even considering going, because you're going to be spending tens of thousands of pounds, if not £100,000 plus, just to be able to get justice. And after you've applied, it might take a year until you even get a hearing date. Meanwhile, you've lost your property, you've lost your home. It's not really a very viable option. And if you do speak at a public inquiry, then of course you can also be cross-examined. One of my proudest achievements was being cross-examined by a QC, as he then was, a very eminent chap whose name I won't repeat now, and then correcting him on various points of law. But it's very unusual that residents would ever have a professional expert witness speaking for them. And after the public inquiry, it will take another few months or so until the local authority hears whether or not compulsory purchase powers are being granted, and it's for the local authority to then inform everyone. And when the local authority, normally a council, do get compulsory purchase powers, this is what's called a CPO, so compulsory purchase order, being confirmed. And we get a few regular questions at that point. So can we still sell? Well, yes, of course you can. The council now have the compulsory purchase powers, but they haven't yet used them. It takes time to use the powers, so you can still sell at the moment. If you've got a tenant in the property, then you might think it could be appropriate to be serving notice on the tenant, because you now need to be looking at when to mitigate any losses that you will have to try and get the tenant out before you lose the property to the CPO. But before you serve any notices, find out when the council will be using those powers. Quite a common one at the bottom here is, can I still alter my property? Well, at the moment you can do, but later down the line, when the council serve their next notice, which is called a general vesting declaration, that will set a date that they will own the property. At that point, you can't alter your property unless it is reasonable to do so. So if the boiler packs up, get a new boiler. You need heating, absolutely. But you can't go and fit a brand new kitchen the day before you're about to lose the property just to get a better compensation package. So there are some things that you can do, some things that you can't do. Throughout all of this period, negotiations can still be proceeding. Valuations can still be changed. And here is that general vesting declaration. This is when it gets quite scary, because people will be told in such and such a time frame, and it's minimum 3 months, but it quite often is only 3 months. In 3 months' time, we own your property. If you are still there, then we can send a county sheriff. Think of it like a bailiff. We can send a county sheriff round. But unlike a bailiff, the council can get them out within a couple of weeks. It's a different process that they go through. So in 3 months' time, we own your property. If you're still there, we can send someone round to have you forcibly removed. And that's even if we haven't paid you any money for it yet. Now, what as claimants surveyors we should be doing at that point is serving what's called an advance payment request. So asking the local authority for 90%, so 9/10 of what they think, not what we think, but what they think the claim is worth. And they then have to pay that on the latter of 3 months later after the notice, or when the property is taken under the general vesting declaration. Now that's so homeowners have at least got some money to use. But that is 90% of what the council think it's worth, not what anyone else thinks it's worth. So that there can quite commonly be a disparity there. There are prescribed forms to get these notices in as well, so they do need to be done correctly. Now, if you've got a homeowner who is being given 3 months' notice, then of course they need to make arrangements very, very quickly to be moving. They don't want to be there when the bailiffs are around. If they've got a tenant in the property themselves, then they need to be showing reasonable steps to get the tenant out within those 3 months, or minimum 3 months, which at the moment is proving incredibly difficult because the courts are backed up with eviction procedures going through at the moment, and it's taking a lot longer than that. But at the very least, landlords should be going through the motions, so in mitigation they can show the council that they have taken reasonable steps, those reasonable steps to get vacant possession. And what I just touched upon as well earlier was about what about the time and cost of the lands chamber. So this is if we can't reach agreement. No one wants to go there. Once the general vesting declaration has completed, so at the end of the 3 month minimum process, either side can apply to tribunal. It's the upper tribunal of the lands chamber. But it can cost tens of thousands of pounds, if not over £100,000, to get that decision, and it can easily take a year, sometimes even 2 years, just to get a hearing date. It's not for the light-hearted, or not for the faint-hearted, and that's why, whilst across the country there are thousands of properties that are compulsory purchased every year, residential properties, on residential cases that go to the Land Tribunal, there are probably maybe one every year, sometimes one every 2 years. Extremely rare, and the ones that are, I've read cases, and I haven't found a single one yet where I thought it was right for that to go to tribunal. It's normally a case of someone with more money than sense, or something else going on there. Right. So before I talk about the surveyor's role, any questions on the process from anyone, please?
If anyone wants to put anything in, then do let me know and I'll ask it. I had a question. You know, you were talking about the valuation, and it's 90% of, you know, the figure. Is your, you know, so from a lender's point of view, lenders have lots of audits done to make sure the valuation accuracy is there. How are you audited by anyone in particular, or is it just it's done to an RICS standard? You know, is there anything else? Because what people like to do is dispute values, don't they?
It's purely down to an RICS professional statement saying that the surveyors involved are there to seek an equitable outcome. The problem with that is quite often there will be surveyors who don't comply with the RICS requirements. Perhaps they've been lent on by their clients.
No, but you have to be an RICS surveyor, do you, to do this work?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yes, you do.
Yeah. Okay.
And I did have one very sorry case many years ago, where I was representing a chap who he was a former pastor, so a religious man, and he had two properties on a council estate that were being compulsory purchased. One that he lived in, and one that he could have rented out, but in practice he was storing a lot of fridge freezers, washing machines, and all sorts of things for sale. He sold the one he lived in, and the other property, he had such a high mortgage on it that I was only a few £1,000s short in negotiations of being able to get enough to cover that mortgage. Because this was back at the time where some people were in negative equity. And I was trying desperately to persuade the local authority to pay the extra few £1,000s just to satisfy the mortgage lender, because the mortgage lender was saying, no, we're not going to sell. But it got to the point where everyone else in the entire street, they'd all sold, moved out. Properties have been boarded up. They've got the metal shutters called Cytex up. Very unpleasant to be around there. And then someone set fire to the house. Next thing I know is the pastor, he wasn't insured. The house value had plummeted because it had been practically burnt to the ground. And I'm being contacted by his son. And the reason I've been contacted by his son, it was because the pastor had hung himself. So this was an extremely sorry case where compulsory purchase actually killed someone. I then renegotiated the settlement based on a far lower market value, because of course it's now fire damaged. And I went back to the mortgage lender who'd been saying no, or computer says no. And at this point, they agreed to take a far lower settlement. And if only they'd listened in the first place.
So, well, maybe we can talk about this at the end, because I think, you know, when it comes to valuation, anyone who's ever done a repossession valuation knows how hard they can be. And I think there's an emotional cost that for us as surveyors that we need to think about. So perhaps we can talk about that as the at the end, because I don't know how, God, I would be so goddamn angry. I would be no good doing this kind of work. But yeah, I think there's lots of stories that can be told and need to be shared. It's really but it's the reality, you know, it's the reality of people's lives, but it all comes down to paper and money, doesn't it? We've got a couple of questions in here. how does the local authority value the property that is subject to CPO? Is it a market value confirmed by RICS valuer, or is it a different process? So you value it and then the council value it as well? And then
Yeah.
you're in the middle? Is it
It
same
was-
process?
So typically the local authority will have appointed their own chartered surveyor, or doesn't necessarily need to be chartered, could be ASOCRIX or EFRIX. And the claimant, so the homeowner, will appoint their own as well. And they will then both negotiate. But on so many of these, in particular with the council estates that we work on, you'll find that nothing has sold in the last 5, 10, 15 years. And the reason that nothing has sold is because everything's been blighted whilst people are waiting to find out whether compulsory purchase is going to happen or not. So it's extremely difficult to get comparables. And if you have a particularly commercial acquiring authority who know that there's a piece of government advice that tells them that they have to negotiate. So if they have to negotiate, then by definition, they're going to offer less than it's worth, first of all. But if they don't need the properties for another 2-3 years or so, then they've got time on their side. So some will offer a lot less than it's worth in the knowledge that they've got time on their side to increase. Some authorities are absolutely fantastic, and if something's worth £300,000, they might offer 295 to start with, and very quickly you've got to 300 or so, and you're fine. But some, if it's worth 300,000, they will offer 200,000 to start with. But if they're offering that £200,000 to 30 odd different leaseholders, all of which have got relatively similar properties, then some of them are going to be so desperate to move because they've been trapped there for a number of years that they might take the deal.
Yeah.
And then that starts to set precedent, which you've got to argue against. Or they might try to negotiate themselves and say, well, I've got the council up to 230 here. Haven't I done a fantastic job of getting an extra 30,000? Well, not if the market value is 300, you haven't.
Yeah.
There are some really good practices out there with some really good local authorities and good surveyors, and there are some really poor practices available as well.
And is this something that the RICS guidance can help iron out? Or, or can they only look at the valuation side, because the negotiation side of it, I mean, is that a government thing then?
Well, the RICS professional statement refers to surveyors seeking an equitable outcome for all parties. So in theory, surveyors should not be taking extremely polarized positions. In practice, it does happen from time to time. I also sit on the RICS expert panel for compulsory purchase. And one thing we've been looking at recently is when surveyors get reported to the RICS, what disciplinary procedure there is. And it's extremely rare that anyone ever really gets properly chastised, that the bar is set too low, in my opinion. And that's why I think people can get away with some of these. I think I saw someone ask about commercial properties as well. In regards to the process for commercial properties, it's relatively similar, with the exception of rather than a minimum 3-month general vesting declaration, there can be a different notice called a notice to treat and then a notice of entry. General vesting declarations are used where there is legal title that needs to be taken, which for commercial properties that there isn't necessarily. If someone's just got a 2 or 3 year lease, then the title's not registered at the land registry, so there's a different notice that gets applied. In regards to the compensation, then there's all sorts of different things that come in for commercial properties as well. Things like temporary and permanent loss of business. There could be extinguishment, so effectively valuing the business if it's unable to relocate. Or there could be relocation costs. Commercial properties are a whole different minefield. We'd probably need another hour or so just to talk about those. So let's try keep this to residential today.
Yeah, thanks for that. And there's just been a comment about valuation, and for those listening, some of you may be valuers or just starting in your journey. Valuation is an art, not a science. It's all about opinion supported by comparable evidence. And what you just described, Dan, so for those who don't know, my background is in defect and valuation claims, and getting down valuations on house purchase, complaints about that. And it's almost as though you've got your worst case scenario, a surveyor scrabbling around for the best comps, trying to get the value that they think is right. And then that's challenged and negotiating it between you. And it's really tough circumstances to do that work. But equally, that's where you've got to be talking and doing the right thing, at the end of the day. But yeah. Oof.
Yeah, and even more difficult if you're dealing with, let's say, a non-traditional build estate where the properties are completely different to everything that's around them and nothing sold in the last 10, 15 years.
Yeah.
You can easily be 10% different very, very, very easily, even if both sides have been completely honest. But yeah, it all comes out in the wash, as they say.
Yeah.
So if I move on to the last, I think 2 or 3 slides now. So the surveyor's role on an adversarial nature. So there is a government circular, so a piece of government advice that says with compulsory purchase, local authorities are required to negotiate. So if they're required to negotiate, that means they have to offer less than the market value to start with, or less on some other element. But how big is that negotiating gap going to be? Now, for claimants, it can also be very difficult because let's say we're dealing with one of these non-traditional builds, a 2-bedroom low-rise concrete flats, maybe large panel system build. They're quite common in compulsory purchase. As far as the claimant is concerned, they're saying, well, I want to be able to have enough money to buy a 2-bedroom Victorian conversion flat around the corner because it's the same size of what I've got right now. Because they're looking at worth. What the 2-bed flat around the corner is worth to them is the same as what their flat is worth. The problem, of course, is that we are assessing value, not worth. So that's something we need to get round. There might be very, very few comparables. We may find that some claimants have got certain expectations when it comes to negotiating. Some will treat it like an insurance claim. Don't do a deal until you get the 3rd offer. Some will do a deal as soon as you get them to a fair figure. Some will only do a deal if you get them a huge increase. So it's difficult to judge individual by individual how you can bring all of these people to that equitable outcome of reaching agreement at a fair price. So who's negotiating? Is there a surveyor negotiating directly for the claimant? If there is a surveyor negotiating for the claimant, does the surveyor know what they're doing? I get told of comparables when I'm negotiating that Joe Bloggs surveyors negotiated. And I find that, well, Joe Bloggs doesn't do compulsory purchase, hasn't got the first idea what they're doing. Have they made a mistake? So we need to then treat it with a little bit of caution. Is the claimant negotiating directly themselves? The professional statements that I've referred to a couple of times now says you must provide your client with balanced and professional advice that seeks to secure an equitable outcome for your client. Now, an equitable outcome then therefore needs to be justified. So if you think that the market value could be anywhere between 290 and 310, then you might be reporting 300, but then you really shouldn't be asking for more than 310 because you're there to seek an equitable outcome. It's got to be justifiable. And in negotiations in a falling market, it can be even more difficult because it's more difficult for an acquiring authority to increase offers in a falling market. But for a claimant, it's very difficult to tell them, well, yeah, your offer now is £10,000 less than it was a few months ago because market values have fallen in the area. Particularly if they know that that they've got a next door neighbour who agreed a few months ago, whose sale is still sat with solicitors going through conveyancing, who is still selling at that higher price. We'll also regularly get involved with advising on shared equity schemes. This is something that's very, very common in compulsory purchase on estate regeneration schemes, where a local authority, often with a developer, will build a number of properties to be sold on a shared equity basis. But notice that I'm emphasizing equity, not shared ownership. So we often have to explain what the difference is. So shared equity, you own the whole property, but there is a charge in section C at the land registry. So much like a mortgage is a charge, and that charge needs to be paid off when the property sells, but that charge will relate to a percentage. So if you put in half the money when you buy it, you own it outright. And if you sell it on in 10, 15, 20 years time, you still own, well, you at the point that you sell, you're getting half the money back. And it's at that point that the council or the developer are getting their share out. Now, whilst you own it, great, because you're getting to live somewhere that's worth far more than you've actually paid for it. Whilst with shared ownership, you would typically own part and rent part. There is no rent with shared equity. These can be fantastic deals that a lot of clients on estate regeneration schemes will take, but the devil will be in the detail. So, for example, with the stamp duty, if someone's selling at 300,000 and they're buying somewhere on a shared equity basis at 600,000, even if they're only putting in 300 themselves, and let's say the council are putting in the other 300, they have to pay the stamp duty on the full 600,000. Now, if they're paying stamp duty on the higher amount, but they are only able to reclaim it based on the lower amount, because if we remember back to disturbance compensation, you're reclaiming based on the price that you're selling at, then there's a big shortfall. So are we able to negotiate for the council to meet that shortfall? Are we able to negotiate any other scheme concessions? Can we get a service charge subsidy, for example? Because quite often people's service charges will triple once they move into a new build flat. What about things like rights of succession? If someone's got a child living with them and they died, that is the parent died, the owner died, would their child be able to inherit the property on the shared equity basis, or would it need to be sold at that point? There are various questions that we go through with every scheme that we work on, and then we put out our own guides to clients to say, this is what we like, this is what we don't like about the scheme. And another big part of the surveyor's role is identifying issues before they become problems. So meeting those individual needs. Bottom center here, we've got a chairlift. A chairlift in the majority of instances is not going, as a stair lift, is not going to increase the market value of a property. But it could be warranted for the claimant who may have a disability and really needs it. In that case, we need to put something in a contract to say that the local authority would pay for a replacement stair lift as well. What about debt? Particularly at the moment with the cost of living crisis as well, where more people are getting county court judgments and debt up to their eyeballs. As surveyors who ultimately want to get paid ourselves when properties sell, we need the properties to sell. For them to sell, then people need to be able to find somewhere else to move to, and how much debt they've got can relate to that. So one thing we'll often do when we're in someone's living room on a first appointment is we'll go through their land registry title with them, and we'll say, oh, according to this, you've got a county court judgment with MB&A Bank or with the council tax. and we'll try to find out, well, how much is it for? And the reason that we're doing that is because we're trying, without being financial advisors, we're trying to work out what are the potential issues here that could hold up a sale. Do we, for example, need to be talking to the local authority to say that this person's not quite going to meet the minimum requirements to be able to invest into one of the new builds on a shared equity property? And the reason they can't meet those minimum requirements is because of these county court judgments. So can we get some kind of allowance to allow them to do that? And in one example, and this always shows that there's notice queer as folk, I think is the saying. I was in a property with Mr. and Mrs. And I was going through a number of debts that were on the title. And I think from memory, I think there's about £25,000–30,000 worth of debts because Mr. had been taken to court on a number of occasions. He wasn't talking much in the appointment, though, and I wondered why. And I found out towards the end that his wife, Mrs., didn't know that he'd been taken to court any of these times. I'd have loved to be in a fly on the wall when I left. But on the positive side, we were able to negotiate with the debtors for part payments and full and final settlement. And his budget, well, their budget for buying elsewhere was increased as a result. Then we've got other questions like, well, when would moving suit the claimant? So do we have flexibility for when the acquiring authority need the property? Could we potentially reach agreement now and then have a long stop date for completion of a year or 2 years time from now? It gives the acquiring authority certainty, and it means that we can negotiate sensibly now to get the deal for the claimant. I was in a client's property only this morning where the father used to live there, but the flat has been empty for the last 3 years now, since the father died. It's used somewhat as a shrine to him now. There were even birthday cards up, because the family is still buying them and opening them for their late father. And the daughter that I met with said, I need more time to empty out my late father's belongings. And we agreed, okay, well, let's see if we can get you until the end of January next year. So she's got almost a year to empty everything out. But by knowing the circumstances, we were able to then have a conversation with the acquiring authority to see what could be done. And can we, as surveyors, can we find properties for people to move to? Can we speak with estate agents, solicitors, mortgage brokers, anything we can to facilitate moving? And the more we're able to do for all of these things is the more we're able to mitigate any anxiety, any flight or fight response, because we do get the flight and fight response, which is when people become anxious. There will be some people who will bury their heads in the sand, say, I don't want this to happen to me. I'm just going to ignore it. Ultimately, though, it is going to happen. And if you wait till the last moment, it's going to be even more anxious and very difficult for you. And there will be some people who take a very different attitude of, well, I don't want it to happen, and I'm going to do everything I possibly can to stop it happening. And sometimes they've got very, very valid concerns. And sometimes it's simply a case of they don't have enough information on what's going on because they don't understand it. They're scared. And if they're scared, then we get that fight response. So as surveyors, we need to try and explain as much about what's going on as possible. And I mentioned earlier the lady who padlocked her head to construction gates. This is her in the middle here. This is a scheme in North London at the West Hendon estate. Her mother was the 86-year-old regional darts champion who'd been on the One Show. And all of this was because we tried to get her mother moved before everyone else because she had terminal lung and heart conditions. And she had she had construction vehicles going within a few meters of her front door every single day to these construction gates. Local authority unfortunately said no, if she wants to move, she can sell. We tried to get her moved temporarily whilst we negotiated. It all kicked off. There was then a petition of, I think, about 250,000 people or so signed it. It got in the Daily Mail, the one show. And this lady, he's called Glynis, very conveniently lost the key to this bike D bar, which acts as a padlock. And this very nice fireman had to come and cut it off for her. And just to show the sorts of people that we have to get involved with, because it's very colourful, is the Bic biro tops. And this is a story going back about 10 years or so now, where we once had a client who would not speak with anyone. He'd boarded off half of his house and lived in the other half. But he had a huge jar of Bic biro tops. These are the really cheap pens that cost about 10-15 pence each, and just these little black lids to them. And he'd collected these, and he had hundreds of them, in 2 or 3 jars, in fact. And I spent probably about an hour or so going through this Bic biro top collection with him before he was willing to look into my eyes and start talking rationally. And eventually we got him through. We got a social worker involved as well, and he ended up selling. But we have to deal with the individual people. In fact, yeah, almost done. Quick as I can, because I realise we're running out of time now. Right, we also have, as surveyors, we also have to advise landlords as well. So we'll have to advise on capital gains tax rollover relief. So ordinarily, when you sell an investment property, you have to pay tax within, it's now 60 days. Until recently, it was 30. With compulsory purchase, if you jump through a couple of hoops, you can roll that into a new property. So we need to advise on that. Also about evictions. So there are eviction specialists that we work with that we always refer people to. Really important to get that done properly, because it's taking an average of over a year now to get vacant possession through the court process. So if you do it wrong, it sets you back quite far. And also providing some investment advice as well. People are more likely to sell if they think that they've got somewhere that they can replace their income with. I mentioned the activists as well. These are just a few examples. Activists are getting very sophisticated now, to the point where these top 2 pictures have got exactly the same sign. Public housing, not private profit. One is based in North London and the other is based in South London. And I've seen that same sign on half a dozen other council estates as well. It's been passed on from one to another. And this bottom one, Shearwater residents saying no to mass destruction. This was a scheme in Woking, where I think there were about 50 or 60 of these estate agent type boards that were all around the estate. And I think that is it. Yeah, there's my contact details at the bottom for anyone who would like to get in contact. We are going to be looking to expand our team as well. We're based in North London, in Finchley. So anyone who's hopefully been enthralled by what we do and not too scared, by all means, drop me a line if you'd like to talk about that as well.
Dan, that's really insightful, and I mean I've learned loads that I didn't, and I'm sure people watching this will too. We've got a couple of really quick questions, if that's all right.
Yeah.
How common is compulsory purchase? I mean, in my head, I think about the days of knocking down the slums and building towers, and now I'm thinking HS2 and trains. But how common is it?
It's a lot more common than you think. What most people know about now are the likes of HS2 and Crossrail, and they do work a little bit differently because they're different processes to get compulsory purchase powers. linear schemes tend to be. The compulsory purchase that we deal with tends to be estate regeneration schemes, but a lot of it is centered within London, and I would say maybe half of the London boroughs have got at least one, if not two, estate regeneration schemes that they're dealing with right now. Yeah. But there is a lot less outside London, purely because financially it doesn't stack up so much.
So you got more space you can build elsewhere, whereas in London you haven't. You talked about sort of like range of values and the value and valuation challenges and difference of opinion, and some of you listening may or may not know about the about case law around this, and we've got this range of values that's acceptable. And there was a famous case, eServe versus Web Resolutions, which talked about 5%, 10% and 15% range of values, and that's in more private purchase. Is there anything on the compulsory purchase side, range of values? Just going back to your point at the start or earlier on about getting the valuation right, has anything of that been challenged in that way?
There hasn't been, because as surveyors we're not typically acting as an arbiter. We're not setting a value. It's something that's being negotiated.
Right. Okay.
And if it can't be negotiated and it then goes to tribunal, it's then for the tribunal member, which is typically a surveyor, to then make a determination. But of course they're already acting in a judiciary capacity when they're setting it. Yeah,
cool. We've got a couple of comments in the chat here just saying how helpful it was. So thank you for that. One just final thing, you mentioned about expanding and doing this work. How do you have to specifically get trained to do this kind of work, or do you become a valuer and then join a company and learn how to do it? Is there like a course? How do you
No, it is purely on the job training, and there is the Compulsory Purchase Association. Compulsory Purchase Association. I used to be on their board a number of years ago. They do provide training sessions every now and then, but they're things very, very similar to what we've just done today. Most people just do training on the job. In my case, I was working up in Birmingham when I was training to be a surveyor, and Birmingham City Council, who I worked for, had their own compulsory purchase team. So I was interested in it because I was living on an estate undergoing regeneration myself. So I was personally affected by this as well.
And if you listen to the podcast that I put into the link or search it, it's episode 16, not 15. You can find out all about Dan's story there. But yeah, so you had a team that, and I guess you trained through them.
Yeah, I did. But now, well, between two different brands that we run, because there's Sawyer Fielding and Websters Surveyors, which is more traditional valuations and home surveys. There are 15 of us now, and we do more residential compulsory purchase than any company in the UK by a very, very long way. And most of my team don't do compulsory purchase. Most of my team do the Websters work.
Yeah. Cool.
So there are very few people. There are very few people who do it.
Okay, so there are good opportunities for people to expand and to, I was going to say, expand their valuation repertoire. Sounds like a performance, but look, thank you ever so much for that. I'm going to cut the recording there for anybody who's listening. So let me just press stop.